how to make all this make sense. Welcome, Yujing.
All right, thank you, Katie. And thanks, everyone, for staying to the last session. I thought everyone have a long day. So today, I'm just not going to talk too much about the technical detail, rather than some thought leadership regarding token economics. Well, nevertheless, who doesn't care about economics, right? Especially in this AI era. So today's talk is about the economics and the collapsing of closed source lock-in. Why do I call it a closed source lock-in? Just think about it. What if your 60,000 annual GPT spend could be cut to 5,000, right? Anyone who builds AI agent or AI tools these days most likely start either with Anthropic model or OpenAI's model. Because this is understandable, everyone wants the highest performance. But what comes with these two models are the highest bill as well. So does the cost really matters, or it doesn't, right? From our observation, most of the founders do care about cost in the end. But when your infrastructure is actually locked into those closed source models, it's really, really hard for you to do any optimization when it comes to the cost. So that's why we think one of the real AI bubble today is the closed source dominance. And the painful burn rate comes with it. Closed source has its merit, of course. It can has a single-digit performance rise comparing to open source models or fine-tuned open source models. But is this single-digit performance gain really worth it? That's an open-ended question for everyone here. Because if you choose to go with the closed source models forever, the numbers won't lie. You see, this is a demonstration of the model token cost for popular models like GPT-5, Claude Sonnet, Gemini, or if you use open source models like DeepSeek V3.1 or OpenAI's latest open source model, OSS 120B. So the comparison is quite obvious. If you ever think about reducing your bill or switching to a different route, there are basically two strategies. One is try to build your entire stack model agnostic. Means your entire stack needs to adapt to most common closed source models or open source models as well. Then you have the leverage to negotiate between different providers. You know, even closed source model is open for negotiation. If you go to Anthropic or AWS saying, if I switch to Google, they give me this amount of discount, they will probably match the discount as well. But if your tech stack only works under cloud, then you don't really have the leverage to go to other providers and ask for a discount. Another approach is open source model plus reinforcement learning. This will tap into the actual technical details of training, which some people might not like. But this is more of a last year, because if you think about when we first have the GPT moment, people think about, I want to train my own model, I want to use my own data and build my moat. But it doesn't really happen because SFT is so hard to control. So I'm not sure how many of you here have ever tried SFT using an open source model. Could you raise your hand? Yeah, only a couple. You will realize that SFT is trying to change the entire weight, or even if you use LoRa, you're still trying to change the majority of the weight. And what it ends up with is just teaching the model to follow whatever instruction data you provided. If you're trying to use AI in a vertical domain, especially in agent, A common sense is the SFT route doesn't really work. But reinforcement learnings are a little bit different. Since early this year, people has proven that reinforcement learning can be something that can actually teach the model to adapt and to perform better on the tasks you want them to. So it's quite different from the traditional SFT, where you basically just feed entire data into it, rather than you build a playground for the model so the model can learn your actual use case. It requires, in general, it requires less tokens and less compute to train it. And eventually, it will give you better performance if you do it right. All right, let's do some deep dive into two strategies. The first strategy we talked about is model agnostic. Usually, if you want to build a tech stack, there are a couple layers. We have the infrastructure layer. Above it is the model layer. Then we have the inferencing, AI application, service, and the actual solutions you're trying to build. If you're trying to be model agnostic, the thing we suggest is to replace this model layer. Try to use at least 2 different closed source models to start with, to make sure that your solution isn't locked in a specific user. 90% of the time, it means your solution doesn't locked into cloud. What are the current blockers? AI companies, especially startups, when they first started something, they just want to have it fast, which I get it. We are also a startup. We want to start everything fast. But that's sometimes not the reason why we choose to be that hacky. You need to build your testing suite properly. You also need to build your own benchmark properly, so you know what's the difference between at least 2 different model providers, rather than having all your prompt engineering focus on one specific model. Trust me, that also works better if you trying to be model agnostic, because in that way, either the prompt engineering or the context engineering will be more systematic, and you have better abstraction layer above them. The step forward, of course, is try to build API abstraction layers. Think about why you choose a specific way of prompting it and how you manage your context. That's probably the most important. And you need to create a model evaluation harness so you don't do only single model. Also, you want to standardize prompts and data flow, which I guess a lot of people already been doing, and incrementally migrate your workloads. If you figure out some model might have some flakiness or unreliable. So in the current state of art, model agnostic might be the easiest way to achieve comparing to the second strategy. You just need to address all the blockers, have at least 2 models in your system that you can verify and prove working. Then you can achieve your end goal, which is model agnostic. When, for example, if cloud is down, you can still switch to Gemini. If Gemini is done, or if the new model doesn't come as intended, you can switch back to another provider. That will greatly boost your reliability as well. We've seen so many cases when people relying on a single model and the model suddenly got updated without telling them, and all their test case would just fail. That's so common because remember, those proprietary models, they will not notify you for a niche update. But sometimes you're relying on a very specific response from that very specific version, right? And sometimes that can just fail. Now, let's talk about the second strategy, which is open source plus reinforcement learning, aka building your own moat. I think a lot of people will like this word moat because this is something we've been missing for at least the entire last year. Because a common sense in a market, especially in the Bay Area, is, well, as a startup, you don't really have the capability or the resource to train your own model and just forget about it. Just relying on cloud or Gemini or OpenAI, and they will just come up with a better model, so they will solve your problem naturally. A lot of people hold that thought, and I've also seen a lot of startups starting giving data to those model trainers, and in hope they can solve their problem. But if you think about it, that's your data, right? That's the moat you're trying to build, not trying to help those proprietary model providers to incorporate into their own. So RL actually gave us a shot. If you can design a reward model smartly and build the playground it needs, you are actually building your moat with a fraction of the cost people ever thought about training a model. And as it goes, if your reward model proven to be working, that means you don't really need to change the stack too much. You just need to feed the data into it, and the model will evolve alongside with all the users. How great is that? And the cost, to be honest, is actually not that high. For a typical RL, the investment for a 40B training is about 400K. So from a startup perspective, this is definitely something acceptable. And not all startup can come up with 40B of their own user data either. So 4B might be the data you have, or even 400 million. You never know. You can just try it out. So if you have 4B data, the cost will just shrink to 40K, which is like nothing compared to the amount of token you burn through Anthropic or Cloud or Gemini, right? And what's the beauty in it is by doing the reinforcement learning by yourself, you can actually solve some problems those proprietary models cannot yet. Will they catch up? Maybe. But if you can solve the problem before they do, that gives you an edge against other competitors that's in the same domain. That's for sure. And if you look at some popular companies like Cursor or Perplexity, they're starting to do the open source plus RL route by themselves as well, right? In order to create their moat, they have gained so much user data. It's just a waste to sit on a gold mine and not using it, or just feeding it to your potential competitors like Cloud Code. I guess a lot of you here doesn't really work work in the code generation domain. You probably have your own verticals, which is even better, because if you can start doing RL starting from today, that gives you such a huge edge comparing to other latecomers or other competitors that don't do RL. Some of the misconceptions we've seen from people are limited RL expertise in-house, that's for sure. Reinforcement learning are only popular since probably March. So we're talking about a little bit over 6 months. So we work in the AI infrastructure community. We know how many people are starting to ramping up, but still it's really hard to find good engineer or good person to build your RL infrastructure. And that's why sometimes providers like us can kick in to help you build it as well. Another common misperception is high infrastructure cost. I've already talked about it. It's actually not that high compared to how much data you have. Some people might also say this is a cultural hesitation in the Western market, which is for sure. US market has been waiting for a good open source model for too long, ever since DeepSeek is debuted. Some people don't feel it's a problem training on DeepSeek, but some people do, which is totally understandable. But something I want to say is with the release of the new GPT OSS, now we have a good model in the US market as well, so you can do reinforcement learning on. So it's never too late, even if you're hesitated about what data they use to train DeepSeek. Another is lack of production-ready frameworks, which is true probably back in 4 or 5 months. But now, with popular frameworks like STIME or SGLang, they all start supporting reinforcement learning. It's actually up to a stage when most of the startup can't afford to have a reinforcement framework. And of course, if you need any consultation, you can come to us. You can think about RL as more of a strategic investment rather than a technical cost you have to use. Because you can compare the ROI if you dump 400K into reinforcement learning and reduce your token consumption or your token burn rate by 90%, the number will speak for itself, especially if you're working for a vertical domain agent. So one of the strategic path forward we would suggest is come to us and for cost-efficient training, because as a cloud provider, we do provide one of the best efficient training clusters in the world. And we have all the expertise needed for training open source models, either GPT or DeepSeek. When we talk about cost saving, this is not a very popular, but a very common topic, which is an inference engine. Sometimes people will oversee how much cost it takes in order to host your own model. That's when we say you need a cloud provider, and you need a cloud provider with an inference engine to help you to further minimize the cost, because they will help you to tune the model to the best state that's customized to your own workload. We've seen customers come to us and reducing costs by like 70%, 80%, still same model, but different parameters against different workload. If you use the wrong parameters or wrong setup, sometimes it's just not that cost efficient. If you come to us, we will help you to do the trade-off sometimes between the speed and throughput. For example, if you value speed more over the throughput, we will help you to tune the models so it outputs faster. If you care about the throughput, for example, a lot of them care about the offload work or batch job, then they don't really care about the speed. So in this case, you can save a hell lot by just switching the model to for example, batch mode. As a side note, we not only provide language model, but we also provide video generation on our platform as well. So if you are a content creator company, if you're working on a content creator property, or you train your own video models by yourself or audio models by yourself, we're happy to talk to you to either stage your model on our platform or help you host your entire inferencing stack. Because one of the pain points we've seen these days is people are struggling to find cheap compute, as always. And people are struggling more on finding the elasticity. For example, when a spike comes in, they don't have enough resource to cope with all this traffic. But if you come to us, we will help you do that, and we will do the elasticity on demand for you. So we've been cultivating this domain for a little bit over a year, almost 2 years now. A year ago, if I talk about this topic, a lot of people will laugh at me saying, "You've never used cloud model. You don't know how good it is." Or they will tell me, "There is no other model that's even in comparison with proprietary models," which I agree. But as time goes by, we've seen a gap between open source and closed source are narrowing and narrowing. At some point, I believed they will converge, because as everyone noticed, the scaling law does actually slow down. GPT-5 doesn't achieve AGI rather than a just better version of the model itself. So we believe the model agnostic growth will keep going because the model are converging as well. The second is we have seen a couple enterprise starting the reinforcement learning testing. As far as I can tell, there is very little production yet, other than the big names like Cursors or Perplexity. But smaller or mid-sized enterprise also started trying their reinforcement learning as well, just to solve their specific problem. And if you're in a very niche domain, like those kind of domain that wasn't covered by GPT or cloud, I actually would encourage you to try it, because if you use their model, they might not be able to solve your problem. But if you try reinforcement learning, the model might as well just pick up the trick. For most of the enterprise, we're not looking at 40B of data volume rather than number that's way smaller than that. So we're also seeing rapid training cycles. You probably need your language model, MLOps, in order for you to do fast training, fast deployment, or continuous learning. So overall, I think the trend is clear. The model's capability are emerging. And that's probably the best time for us to be model agnostic. We've covered about some possible scenarios, but let's think for a moment. What would happen if such scenario happens to you? Right? What happens if your current provider increased prices by 30%? Or suddenly dropped? What would you do? Same thing happened for Windsurf, right? When cloud suddenly stopped providing service to them, they panicked. A lot of customer will go. And if you don't start pursue, a second question is, if you don't start to pursue RL today, how are you going to build your moat eventually, or competing with everybody else in the same domain? And for the long run, how would you justify the 10-time cost just for a small single-digit benchmark improvement? What's the internal ROI for such investment? So for here, we call for immediate actions. Everyone at least need to think about it. Are you building model-agnostic tech stack? Are you even thinking about using RL to build your own moat? With that, I can give some closing thought. First, in our opinion, the real AI bubble at this point, one of the real bubble AI at this point is the closed source dependency or single model dependency. Second is, do you have an insurance policy if something happened to your model provider? And do you have a strategic partner if you don't want to build an in-house reinforcement learning team? Right, we're supposed to have a QR code somewhere, but.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. So our booth is right over there. Feel free to step by or ask us any questions if you have.
If anyone had one of those coconuts that was sponsored by, generously sponsored by this company, GMI Cloud. So we have time for a question if anybody has a question.
Thank you for the talk. I mean, I generally agree with you, but being a little bit on the side of the advocate for the devil here, I think you mentioned the RL, the fine-tuning costs here, but I was wondering when you showed the 5K for example, running DeepSeek there. Are you counting, because I mean, like, you know, if you're going to run a model like that, you're going to need at least, what, 1 DXG to run the full model, and that is not going to go for less than, what, 10K a month. So I'm like wondering, how did you get to the cost of 5K a year against the 60K for ChatGPT, because you're going to be having to handle the cost of the infrastructure of the model as well. So I mean, I would like to hear a little bit more on how you got to those numbers.
Yeah. Great question. So besides the training costs, if you only think about inferencing, if you use DeepSeek at this point, yes, you do require a single DGX or HGX server. But first, the price is dropping down. If your volume is high enough, that would definitely make sense. If you're only coping with, like, I don't know, a couple hundreds or up to 1,000 users, then you probably just want to stick with closed source model without doing any reinforcement learning. But still, if you're trying to be model agnostic and be able to switch to a DeepSeek model and using a token provider, that's a different story, because if you use token provider, that's super cheap.
We just want to, in the interest of time, because we do have the conference closing in, ice cream social for us ready in the exhibit hall. So thank you very much for the talk. And if anybody, I saw a couple more hands. If anybody has additional questions, please find Yujing and his colleagues at their booth.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.